In this lesson, we'll talk about the use of stencils and cover some of the new functionality with stencils in 2012. So let's go ahead and open up our scene. And this is lesson 04 start. You can see I've just gone ahead and completed the sculpting on this guy, just going up and down the subdivision levels using the sculpting tools that we talked about. So if you want to go ahead and go through that process on your own model, you can. You can also jump in and start with lesson 04 start. If you want to just follow along with this particular model, you can do that. I've also got another mesh, the teeth, added. And so if you want to add those, you can go to File, Import, and those teeth are going to be located with your project files. You can import those, the OBJ, and you can see that listed here in the object list. Okay, so working with stencils, as we sort of touched on, is just kind of selecting one of these images, and you can see we can hold down S again and just kind of move that stencil around in position, and then we paint through it just as we looked at. But there's some added functionality here in Mudbox 2012 where we can actually create our own stencils from the web or from the Mudbox community, and we can actually edit those, so we can deform them, paint on them, and do a lot of different things with them before we actually start to use them to sculpt or paint. So let's first take a look at one of the new features, and that is the ability to get an image just from the web or wherever we want to copy an image from. So let's say that we are looking for a rhino skin. So I've just done a quick search under images, and let's say that we like this image. So we can go ahead and just right click on this and copy image just straight from the web. Now if we go to actually create stencil, we get a create new stencil option here. Now we have options for the width and the height, so if we wanted to create a blank stencil, we could go ahead and set the values for the width and height and go ahead and do that. But we have two options down here. One is for tiling, but the last option is use image from clipboard. And so that's what we want to do because we just copied that image from the web into our clipboard. So we'll go ahead and click on that. You can see that grays out the options for the width and the height because it's taking those values from that image. So we'll go ahead and say OK. And now you can see that that image has been brought in, and we now have this edit stencil option here. Let me go ahead and just for now cancel out of that. And so I can take this image that we just really quickly copied in here, and if I want to bring in some of these bumps, maybe I can come in and start to use that as sculpting. So I can come in and using S again, move that around, just do a little bit more sculpting on that. And that's an image straight from the web that we've just copied over to be able to use within our project. And so you now have that ability. We can also go into the Mudbox community, and as I showed you earlier, we have the library that we can access for different stamps and stencils. So let's just go into stencils, and we'll just go under animals, and we can do a search if we want to, maybe search for elephant, something like that. Okay, and you can see we get a number of different options here for elephant. You can see there's actually a couple of pages of these that we can go ahead and grab. So we can find an image that we like. If we find one that's good, we can go ahead and just click on this little button, and that'll actually load that in, and you can see that loaded up here now. We go back to our 3D view, and you can see now that we have our stencil that we can manipulate. Now, as we bring in these stencils, they're probably not going to match exactly with what we want them to do. So for instance, if we want to create some wrinkling along here, maybe this doesn't really match exactly with the kind of detail that we want to create. So this is where we can start to edit our stencils. So to edit our stencils, we're going to bring that window back up that came up when we created our stencil, and we can go under Edit all the way to the bottom to Edit Stencil. Now you can see that this window comes up and our stencil actually gets a little bit more transparent. We have three different options for displaying our stencil. We can display it in full opacity with color, we can display it with transparency with color, and then we can just display the transparency. So definitely one of these two options you're probably going to use a little bit more because you want to be able to see the geometry underneath in most cases to be able to manipulate this. Okay, so what are we going to do with this stencil now that we've got this edit stencil window open? Well, we can go down to our sculpt tools and use grab. Let's turn off our mirroring. get a larger brush size, and we can start to deform this into position. If you can't really see what's happening as much, you can change your view. Okay, and you can see here how we can actually take this detail on this stencil canvas and kind of move it around and manipulate it. So we can kind of get that into position before we actually paint it down. So once we're done editing our stencil, we can also paint on this, and we'll look at that in a second. But once we're done deforming our stencil, we can save the stencil, or we can just say done. Okay, and so now what we can do is go ahead and use Sculpt to come in and add that detail from the stencil that we've edited. Okay, so this gives us a lot of flexibility. We're not stuck with the images that we bring in from the web. We can take those and now start to deform those and move those around and warp them into to fit the shape of the model that we have underneath it. So a really powerful workflow. We also can come in and actually paint on stencils. So let's go ahead and let's turn our stencil off. Let's actually grab one of these stencils here. Let's get this one. And this is actually black and white skin 04. It's in our stencils. And so we can see this stencil. Let's go ahead and scale it down. And so let's say we want to actually use this, but there's just one little section of it. We need a lot of it. And so what we can do is go into our stencil and we can turn on use tiles. So now you can see all of the tiles. I can still move this around and I can still rotate it, but you can see we're looking at all of the tiles. So what we can do now is actually edit this stencil with the tiling. So go to Edit, Edit Stencil, and now you can see those tiles there. Again, we have the same options for how we're actually viewing this. Let's go to full opacity. And instead of using grab to warp things around, let's go to our paint tools. And I know we haven't covered the paint tools yet, but we'll go ahead and touch on just one of these in this process. So we'll go to our clone paint tool. Now we want to hold down a control key to choose our sampling point. So if you've used Photoshop or anything like that, you're going to be familiar with using clone. Now for the fall off, I don't want to have any blurriness on this, so I'm going to choose a full fall off. And now I can click, control click, and you can see how the cursor changes slightly over here, and then come over here and start to paint through that. And you can see because of the tiling, I can start to create really quickly a nice seamless tile. And I can come in here and start to paint over this. Okay, go a little bit too far, and come in here. So I'm going to be doing this very quickly, but you can spend a little bit more time on it and create a nice seamless tile that you've got that you can now come in, and let's say you're done editing. We're done with that. And now you can see that I've got the tiling. I can scale that down as much as I want. Come in, go to Sculpt, and we can really start to, let's turn off invert. And so you can see that I can really quickly add a seamless skin texture to that with those tiles by just editing one image from our stencil tray. Okay, so that's another way to do it. Now you'll notice when you went into Create Stencil, you'll notice that you have this tiling on as well, and you can use that to create the tiling as well when we bring in or create a new stencil. So you could create a stencil from scratch, turn on tiling, and start to paint through just like we did with that last stencil. Okay, so this really frees us up when we're working with stencils. We can bring in images from practically anywhere. We've got resources within Mudbox to go out and get stencils, and we've also just got the internet. We can go out and grab images. We can use images that we've taken ourselves, bring those in as stencils, and really have a lot of flexibility in editing those stencils to really make them fit the model underneath. So a great feature of Mudbox 2012. You should definitely check that out. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about editing stencils and creating stencils, let's go ahead and look at one last thing, and that is going to be the additional fall-off type. Now, when we're projecting through detail, as we start to project through with stencils, and we get to areas that are not facing us, so areas like this, perfect, it works fine. Areas like this, it's trying to project across that area. So what we can do to avoid that is to use fall off based on a facing angle. So rather than using just a strict fall off like that, but we can actually use a facing angle fall off so that areas that are facing away from us, so starting at 60 degrees away from our view, that fall off will start and it'll go over the next 20 degrees. So after 80 degrees, there's no effect at all from our stamp or sculpting or whatever it is that we're doing. So that means we won't get any stretching across there because the angle is such that the effect won't take place. Okay, so if we just, as an example, let's actually turn our stamp off and let's just get a stencil here. We can use as an example. Here's a brick. And so you can start to see that it's not affecting the areas that weren't facing me. And you can change those values in here. You can change those in if we go ahead and get our sculpt, go back to fall off, we can change those angles here. So if you wanted to start at a lower angle or a higher angle, you can do that in there. So that's just another nice feature that will help you when you're doing your painting with your stamps and stencils and so forth. All right, so now that we've covered some of the new features of stencils, working with stencils in 2012, the next thing that we'll look at is how do we work with sculpt layers. So we'll talk about in the next lesson what those are, some of the things that we can do with those, and really how that helps us create a nice flexible workflow. And we'll also cover some of the new features with sculpt layers. So we'll go ahead and do that next.